Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Ian Hall. I'm the Deputy Director of Research of the Griffith Asia Institute. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'd also like to acknowledge Chris Sames, the Director of the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, who's kindly hosting us this evening. And I'd like to also offer an apology from Professor Caitlin Byrne, the Director of the Griffith Asia Institute, who unfortunately has been called away. I'm afraid you're stuck with me this evening rather than Caitlin, so my apologies for that too. Welcome then. Welcome to the sixth of these Perspectives Asia in 2019. And this is the beginning, I understand, of 15 years of Perspectives Asia, a really important anniversary for us. The series is, of course, a program of public seminars that are designed and promoted by the Griffith Asia Institute, Griffith University, and the Australian Centre for Asia-Pacific Art and the Queensland Art Gallery to explore issues of contemporary culture, politics, society across our very broad region, our expanding region of ours, while fostering public discussion of Australia's relationships with the region. We've been very privileged to host a number of distinguished speakers and a very diverse range of speakers over the various different years that this event has been going on, look at Australia's relationship with its Asian neighbours. I'd like to thank our sponsor too, Yering Station, and I'd like to introduce our two speakers for this evening. On my far left over there, Mr. Fergus Hanson, who's the Director of the International Cyber Policy Centre at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute down in wintry Canberra. Fergus is the author of Internet Wars, and has published widely on a range of cyber and foreign policy topics. He was a professional Fulbright scholar at Georgetown University, where he worked on the uptake of new technologies by the United States government. To my near left here, we've got Dr. Samantha Hoffman, who's a visiting fellow with the International Cyber Policy Centre at ASPI. And Dr. Hoffman's research explores the domestic and global implications of the Chinese Communist Party's approach to state security, with new ways of thinking about how to understand and respond to those approaches. Dr. Hoffman holds a PhD in politics and international relations. So as you can tell from the format on stage here, we're going to have a conversation rather than just a lecture. But first, can I get you to give a warm welcome to both Fergus and Samantha? Now, as you can see for this topic up here on the slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the struggles for power in cyberspace. But I think to kick off, we've really got to try and get a sense of, when we're talking about struggles for power, who's doing the struggling, and what do we mean when we talk about struggles for power in cyberspace, in this virtual world. And I'd also like to ask our two guests too to have a little bit of a reflection, to look out over the next few years and give us a sense about where we're going in this particular area. How are these struggles going to play out? Who is going to win and lose to some degree? And what kinds of consequences will they have for societies like ours? So maybe Fergus, I can throw this to you first.
Sure. Well, thank you, and I just want to thank Chris as well, the gallery and Griffith, for hosting us. It's a real pleasure to be in Brisbane and much warmer than we were just a few hours ago. It's an incredibly interesting time to be working in this space. The struggle is really palpable. This is a new domain, and everyone's feeling their way and trying to work out how they can control this space and use this space to exert power and influence in a global system. And everyone's getting involved. We've got activists who are trying to push their message and convey their views on a whole range of topics, all the way from trying to perpetrate terrorist acts to trying to improve climate change. You've got cyber criminals who are trying to make a dollar by stealing money from individuals, from organisations, from governments. They're probably the worst offenders in this space, proliferating a whole bunch of really difficult operating environments across the internet, making it hard to do business, hard to do to engage on the internet as individuals. And then you've got states, and there's a whole spectrum of state activity. There's states that are engaging in offensive cyber activities. They're trying to weaponise cyberspace to achieve military or political ends. You've got states that are trying to use it to steal money, like North Korea, who are running heists on the central bank of Bangladesh to try and generate revenue for their country. And you've got other states who are just lawless. You've got Russia that releases malware that costs billions of dollars to corporations around the world. So there's a whole bunch of actors in this space. And then I think there's also a struggle that we're having as individuals. So we're getting this new technology thrown onto us, and we're being asked to decide what we want to do about that. So I'll give you an example here in Australia. We're about to launch a system that's called the Face Identification Service, the FIS. Now, you probably haven't heard about the FIS, but there's a piece of legislation that's actively before Parliament to pass this. And this database will create, it uses your driver's license photo or your passport photo, and it's being compiled into a central database where there's a biometric template of your face that's being created. And that will allow every single Australian who's ever owned a driver's license or a passport to be identified using face verification technology. And that could be used in lots of different ways. At a state level, you could use it to pick up people who throw trash on the ground in a park, and you pick up their face and you could email them the fine for doing that. You could have lots of different styles of encroachment on your personal liberties that we now take for granted or decide that that's an act of chance or something that we should deal with at a more community level. So we're being actively sort of forced to confront these technologies. There's not a big debate going on about these, but it's something I think we need to, as a society, come together and decide, what we think is acceptable and what isn't.
Thank you. Samantha, can I come to you? And your research focuses particularly on China. So maybe could you give us a sense of how China is operating in this space and how things like 5G technology, for example, as it rolls out? We know that Huawei, a major Chinese company, has been very much involved in the development of that technology. Can you tell us a little bit about how China's playing in that space? And do you endorse Fergus's sense of this area?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I do endorse everything that Fergus just said, but I look at it from a different perspective. I focus on the Chinese party state and how the Chinese Communist Party tries to both protect and expand its power both inside and outside of the People's Republic of China's borders. I look at issues like the social credit system and the development of smart cities in China, but also identify how those systems for authoritarian control expand outside of the PRC's borders. What's interesting is that if you look at the concepts behind what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, what's its number one goal? Its number one goal is the Chinese party state's security. What does that mean? That means the security of the party and its position in power, and then everything outside of it. So not only is state security and the protection of the party's political power something that the party does inside of China, it also tries to control things like discourse about China and how the world interacts with China and the Chinese people outside of the PRC's borders, to control the narrative about what China is and what it isn't, what China's future is and what China's future isn't, and what Chinese people, how to define Chinese culture and how not to. And those are all issues that are related to state security, but they're also things that are preemptive. They require shaping discourse and shaping how people are willing to behave. And technology has an important role in that. So domestically, the Chinese Communist Party is developing the social credit system. The social credit system, what's most interesting about it is that often in media you see portrayals that are extremely negative. You'll see a person walking around. I think there was a special on the news once where a person was walking around and you saw a number score moving up and down as they interacted, but that's not actually how it works. What's interesting about the system is that it's not always visibly coercive. Actually, the surveillance that the party state uses also isn't always overtly invasive. Control is garnered by creating an sort of instinctive desire within individuals to use or be a part of the product or system that is trying to control them. But the way that this happens is that control is created through the convenience that technology provides. So for government, convenience can be created through the provision of public services. If you look at the origin of, say, smart cities in China, it starts in the early 1990s with the beginning of e-governance projects, and then leads into something called grid management, where it's not just about Ministry of Public Security and surveillance, it's also about improving the ability to register a business and administrative processes. But by doing that, the party is able to use technology to create efficiency, and through efficiency, it's able to improve control. Now, where that expands outwards, there's technologies that aren't always visibly problematic. So you can have something like an environmental pollution monitoring system. You can have CCTV that helps with traffic management. But the one thing that all of these have in common is that they're all collecting data. And even if the technology is deployed in a particular way and it's meant to manage traffic, it's meant to improve environmental pollution monitoring, it doesn't matter if the person who has access to the data or the entity who has access to the data wants to use that in a different way. And that's a part of the problem that we aren't always thinking about. It's almost, I think, oftentimes we think that we can turn on or off a particular use of technology, but you can't if the data is used by somebody who has a different intent. And so we aren't even talking about dual-use technology. We're talking about technology where multiple actors have access to information and can build something out of that information, whether it's in China, a credit system, or if it's surveillance, if it's military intelligence, or if it's actually providing a service. And that's the biggest problem because we can't even quite identify what's good or bad.
Can I just pick up on one aspect of all of this? So we've seen these smart city projects being rolled out in which you've got networks of surveillance and monitoring, feeding data back, being able to control a whole range of traffic lights, traffic flows, all these kinds of things. What's around the corner? So we're seeing, when we see 5G, what can 5G do that 4G can't? Some people are talking about the way in which, for example, with self-driving cars and so on and so forth, in order to make them function properly and so on, you're going to need 5G in order to do that. So can I ask you the technical question? So why? And what's around the corner then? Fergus, perhaps?
Yeah.
Well, let me start with, a big picture response to that. I think there's a couple of really big trends that are happening that are driving this. So first of all, I think you've got a geopolitical struggle for power. You've got a complete restructure of our economies, and I think that's a really powerful force. And we've laid this foundation of technologies that's going to enable a revolution on a different order of magnitude that we've seen already in terms of technology. So if you look at the geopolitical piece, basically you've got the world superpower, the United States, rubbing up against the emerging superpower of China. And what's ultimately going to decide who wins that struggle is the economics of this, who has the greater economy to underpin the power. And when you get to that, you start to think, well, you start to see manifestations of that in the trade war, in the debate we're having right now around supply chain on 5G. Should this be manufactured in China or not? And I think we're going to see a lot more of those discussions about pushing back on unfair trade practices in China, trying to disaggregate some of the supply chains that we've integrated up till this point, and starting to see some bigger tensions at that top tier level. At the restructuring of our economy, there's, I think, some really big forces that are driving this. We've had this long period where we've been offshoring manufacturing around the world, and it's gone to China, it's gone to our neighbours in the north. And what was basically happening there was a trade-off where we were taking higher risk, we were trading off higher risks of manufacturing in countries that were less politically stable for access to lower cost labour. Now, what happens with automation and machine learning and artificial intelligence is that trade-off starts to change back. So once a machine can build something cheaper than a human being, even at the lowest cost that you can pay a human being to do something, then you start to favour political stability over low cost, over the labour cost. And so then you'll see a re-onshoring of manufacturing to Western states. But you're also seeing a development domestically of a whole sort of changes to our economy. We've seen banks lay off 6,000 people in Australia and replace them largely with machines. If you talk to large corporations in Australia, they're talking about laying off thousands and thousands of workers in the immediate term. And we haven't even really got to the point of having very good machine learning or artificial intelligence. So we're on this trajectory where it's both daunting because there's going to be a lot of changes in the job market and the types of jobs that we can get into, but there's also this opportunity for new industries that are going to come up and this opportunity to retrain. The final piece is around this change in terms of the revolution that we're about to experience. We've had all of these technologies that across different areas have laid a base and a foundation for a mass type of innovation. So we're going to see innovation in artificial intelligence, innovation in quantum computing that's going to solve potentially some really difficult problems in terms of medical illnesses that we haven't been able to crack, a whole bunch of problems that we just haven't been able to wrap our heads around with conventional computing. And then we're going to have issues like implantables that'll make human beings a sort of mesh between a machine and the human bodies that we're used to at the moment. So I think all of these types of technologies have the foundations been laid, and we're on the cusp of just sort of realising that. In terms of what 5G and things like that mean, this is a sort of live example. It's not sort of like 3G, 4G, 5G, it's just going to be a faster phone. It's going to be a revolution in the economy. So in the past, we've sort of connected our phones and our laptops. What we're going to be doing with 5G is connecting our whole economy. So it's going to be our transportation system, our hospitals, our solar panels on our roofs. Every single part of our economy is going to be connected up to this one system. And so what that does in terms of how our economy is structured is instead of having different pieces of critical infrastructure that are all quite equal, you start to have a pyramid where there's one piece of critical infrastructure, 5G, telecommunications, that sits at the top. And if you can take out that piece of that piece of critical infrastructure, the whole economy collapses. So it creates a unique vulnerability in our system, but it also creates this very different type of society and efficiencies that we could never realise before.
So Fergus, I'm going to come back to you on this because you've talked a little bit about some of the positive things that might flow from these technologies, but your work also focuses a lot on cyber espionage and using information technology for espionage, and also on political interference and the use of things like social media platforms to influence political debates and so on. Can I get you to make a comment maybe about the scale of this problem, about who's doing it as well, and how tactics are changing in that area?
Sure. I mean, so first of all, I think it's sort of useful to distinguish. We sort of have this word cyber attack, or there's all these sort of words that just generic catch-alls. There's a few different types. So cyber espionage is sort of one of these activities where we're spying on each other's countries, and that's sort of an accepted piece of international relations. China will try to spy on the United States, and the United States will try and spy on China. Then there's sort of a corridor of illegal activities where stealing intellectual property, states have regarded as an illegal practice. That there's sort of activities like that are sort of taboo. And then there's sort of political interference. And this is one of these areas where I think states are starting to erect barriers and say this is unacceptable to interfere in our domestic political systems. There's UN law around this, international law, and that's another area that's sort of quite distinct, I think, from, say, espionage, which is regarded as legitimate. So if we look at this, what technology has done to change the old system of espionage, this spying piece, if previously you'd have to put in quite a bit of effort to steal other people's government secrets. So if this particular government wanted to steal Australia's sort of briefing notes on a particular meeting, you'd have to work out how to intercept a telephone call, or butter somebody up in a bureaucracy who might with a certain amount of cash give you a copy of the note. It was a long, laborious process, and you'd end up with a very small amount of treasure at the end of it. What the internet has enabled is all of that information is stored on these common drives that we have in all our workplaces, and as long as you can bust your way into the electronic system, you can just steal the whole lot in one go. So the scale that you can conduct espionage on now, as we saw with the Edward Snowden leaks, for example, is just sort of a million times greater than we've ever imagined of doing it before. So it's a very different type. If you look at political interference, it's sort of similar. So we've had in the Cold War efforts to try and manipulate others' elections, but again, it was very labour intensive, very expensive. You needed to put a lot of resources into it if you were going to have any kind of impact. In the case of the 2016 US presidential election, there you had a case where for basically a shoestring budget, they had to send a couple of agents into America to do a bit of research on the ground. You were able potentially to swing the election of the most important elected official in the whole planet. So you've got this remarkable ability to run pretty effective campaigns remotely at very low cost and in areas where it was previously very difficult to do that. So I think that's the type of change we're seeing, and it's happening in lots of different countries around the world. We've tracked it in 20 different democratic elections in the last, since the 2016 election, in lots of different places around the world. The two main actors are Russia and China.
So look, you're obviously involved at ASPI and your unit's involved in giving policy advice to government and talking government through and talking politicians through. So can you give us a little bit about what the Australian government is trying to do to address some of these problems?
In terms of countering foreign interference?
In terms of interference in particular.
Sam, you might want to jump in here as well on the foreign interference piece, but I think we've passed a whole series of laws where we've tried to make it harder for foreign states to be able to manipulate opinion in Australia and interfere in our domestic politics. Now, we've seen politicians, for example, who have been caught out advocating positions, for example, in the South China Sea, contrary to their official party position. We've seen cash in supermarket bags go to political parties. So we've seen lots of different pieces of evidence that we're starting to see foreign governments trying to manipulate our political system. I think we've gone part of the way there, but we haven't had any prosecutions or any particular sort of suggestions that this is sort of winding that back. So I think we've got a long way to go before we're able to sort of create a system where we're pushing it back against activities of, say, the United Front, which is essentially a sort of influence organ of the Chinese Communist Party that's operating in lots of different spaces in Australian society. We've got those kind of issues that I think we need to really grapple with. And I think one of the biggest challenges we've got is also the sort of political donations. So we're still a country where political parties can solicit money from organisations and individuals, and that's essentially a corruptible process. I think the sooner we can move to a model where it's taxpayer-funded elections at all levels, we'd be much, much better off in terms of locking down at least our political process. But I think there's lots of different things we have to do on that front.
Well, yes. Well, hard to disagree with that, I think. Samantha, I'm going to come back to you. Now, at the beginning there, you talked a little bit about the social credit system. So the notion of giving individual citizens a particular score according to their social behaviour. So if they've broken petty rules, or if they've not paid their taxes, or if they haven't sent their children to school, they might get a lower score or something like that. And then that has an effect in terms of being able to book airline tickets or be able to leave the country and so on, potentially. Stop me if I'm getting this wrong, okay? So now, that's something obviously of significant concern to Chinese citizens, but maybe could you also say something about the spillover of the social credit system itself? And we've seen recent newspaper reports about China not just blacklisting particular academics or think tankers or politicians and so on from going into China, but also creating a whitelist of people that are kind of approved experts who are allowed to come and to have particular privileges and so on. That's that in a way is an extension of social credit system, isn't it? So how is this spilling over?
So first, the concept of the social credit system. The social credit system isn't quite like if you've seen Netflix series called the Black Mirror is the name of the TV show, and it's often compared to that, but it's actually kind of false because you don't have a score that's moving up and down of each interaction that you have. It's not that. It's something that's a lot more complicated and difficult to explain. But essentially, you've got data going in from government sources, from economic sources, and from third-party sources that are going into mostly either government agencies or local governments, and then filtered out into multiple products that are related to the credit system. One of those things could be a creditworthiness determination about whether or not you get a bank loan. One of those things could be a blacklist. One of those things could be a credit website where if you look up your company's universal social credit code, which is just an ID number, you'd have information about your company, its business registration, and whether or not you've done something dishonest. And the same for individuals and entities like social organizations. So it's not just a score, it's multiple products that are being created from masses of data that are then funneled into different things. And it's not cohesive, it's not something that there's one government department controlling it. Actually, across China, each province and municipality has their own credit system development. There are there's leading groups of many different government departments that are involved, so it's not one entity, it's not one thing. So that's the first clarification. But the second thing is that it also extends outward. And we had evidence of that last year when the Civil Aviation Administration of China sent 33 international airlines letters that said they had to change the way that they referred to Taiwan on their website. And if they didn't change the way that they referred to Taiwan on their website, and that included airlines like Qantas, that they would then be accused of serious dishonesty for not implementing an order that they were given from the Civil Aviation Administration. And then that accusation of serious dishonesty would have been made on a aviation administration website that then got forwarded to other credit agencies and other government agencies for fines or for other enforcement against that company. What's interesting, though, is that for those airlines, they weren't told to change their China-facing websites, and some of them actually tried to negotiate with the Civil Aviation Administration and say, well, can we make a China-facing website to list Taiwan as part of China there? And they said, no, actually, this is your international-facing website. And that's an interesting detail, because then what China's done with this is say that our laws are being enforced on your websites internationally and for your customers internationally. And it's not that the PRC trying to define what Taiwan as a part of China is something new, and it's not a new demand, but what is new is the way that the social credit system allows it to coordinate action, as well as the businesses didn't have much of a choice, and we didn't have the policy responses to deal with it at the time.
So just last question, I'm going to throw it open. So last question really is, so how do we respond to that? I mean, how do we as individuals, because we do have individual choices to make here, but how do governments respond to that kind of policing of the naming of things, even outside the borders of the state?
For some of the issues, and there's also a side of this that I didn't address, which is that overseas Chinese can also be affected. So then you have a civil liberties issue. The Ministry of Public Security in China is responsible for developing one of these codes for overseas Chinese who are returning to China. And that means, from the way that I understand it, that their activities overseas could then be judged when they return to China, as well as overseas Chinese federations. So it's a way of the party trying to exert control over people overseas, which means that we have a civil liberties problem. Citizens who should enjoy the rights within our countries, whether it's the US or Australia or anywhere else, that they aren't necessarily fully enjoying those rights if they have another state imposing on them. So that's one issue. I don't know how to solve it. But one of the issues that is a bigger picture, not just with social credit, but also smart cities, is privacy. I think oftentimes people frame privacy as if, oh, I don't have any, so doesn't matter, or I'm not doing anything wrong, so they have nothing to catch me for, or I've got a camera cover on my webcam, so I'm fine. But actually, the issue is hundreds of pieces of data about you being collected and how that can be used in the future. And some of that could be good, but some of that could be bad. I have a report coming out in a few weeks that identifies how a company is involved in collecting data globally, a Chinese company that's linked to the party state directly, collecting data globally from sources that you would think are actually perfectly fine. But in reality, they admit to doing things like military intelligence, doing things that support state security as well. And so how do you draw the line? Well, first thing is privacy rights. How do you protect data privacy? And we don't have answers to that in any country. I think the European Union is closest, but even then, it's a bit of a mess.
Could I jump in on this question? I mean, one of the things that I think was really interesting about the response in the airline example was that we're gripped up as democracies to sort of say a decision like this is something that, it's between the businesses to work out. Let's leave it to Qantas to decide whether it refers to Taiwan as a country or part of China. But what we're dealing with here is not a sort of regular state. It's not like dealing with Hungary or Belgium that says, we'd like you to call this particular place, this particular way. You're dealing with an authoritarian regime that has a very different approach to how to deal with these kind of things. And I think what we need to do is we can't allow our companies to just be held hostage every single time that this comes along. This requires a sort of nation state level response. And you could say, well, could Australia really stand up to China and say, we're going to insist that Qantas calls it, Taiwan is, its own country or separate from China? Okay, well, maybe that's going to be difficult. But what you can have is a bandwagoning effect where all 33 countries could come together and say, well, this is preposterous and we're not going to, stand for this. And if you don't want to have any flights coming into China, well, that's fine. You won't have any, you're not going to get access to any of our airports either. So I think you could deal with this problem as a collective group, but if you let your companies deal with it individually, you're going to get bitten off. So I think we need to change the way that we respond to these types of coercive behaviours.
Okay, so we've covered an enormous amount of ground here, and we've talked to us about struggles that are between states. There's struggles also for individuals and for societies, for companies, corporations, and so on and so forth. And we've also talked about the way in which technologies are evolving and giving us us individually new capabilities, but also states and other actors too. What I want to do, though, is I want to throw this open. I imagine that there's quite a number of questions that people have got. Could you state your question fairly succinctly, if you could, please? And if you'd like to direct them to one or other of the speakers, then please do so. Okay, so I've got one over here, please. Yes.
Can I ask Fergus? I know that DD is a Chinese-owned ride-sharing company. What guarantees are there that our credit cards won't land into the hands of the Chinese government? Are there any laws that the Australian government put in to guard against that sort of thing?
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Sure.
Good.
Do you want to go? Or?
Yeah, let's just go ahead and we can bunch some later, depending on how many hands go up.
Okay. I think that's a great question. I mean, this is a really interesting phenomenon because you have a whole bunch of hoo-ha around, what is Facebook doing, what's Twitter doing, what's Google doing with my personal data. But we're not having a discussion about what happens when you've got, a WeChat, which is used by 1.5 million Australians, lots of different Chinese platforms that are used by Alibaba, all these different platforms that lots of Australians use on a daily basis. And what's really interesting is you can because the American tech firms are based in a democracy, you can haul up their executives before Congress, you can quiz them, you can get lots of information about what's going on. Even if you don't necessarily like the answers they give you, they're at least responsive to the requests that governments make of them, and they try to explain their positions and put forward evidence about what they're doing and change their policies around that. What you have in China is a completely different situation. So one of the reasons why we didn't allow Huawei to build our 5G network is because there's a law in China called the National Intelligence Law that obligates all companies that are based in China to engage in espionage activity if they're asked to do so by the state. So, of course, we can't allow a company like Huawei to build our telecommunications network if the Chinese Communist Party at any point can come along and say, you must give us all the information that's travelling across that network. So there is absolutely no guarantee that any company that is based in China can secure your data. It's impossible under the law in China to do that. And any law that's passed in Australia isn't going to be able to solve that problem for you either, because the companies, even if they wanted to protect your data, which I think probably many of them do, have absolutely no capability to do that because ultimately they can be compelled.
Okay, I've got one here, I've got one in the middle and so on, but yes, please.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for this amazing conversation. It's really good to hear kind of perspectives on the global, what's happening in the global data field, in the Chinese data field, and the Australian data fields, and this conversation kind of happening in a joint space, because this is becoming an increasingly joint problem. I do have a China-specific question for Samantha, though. Which is about within the social credit system, do you see any fractures, either horizontal or vertical fractions where data is just not going through and not fulfilling the purposes that it kind of was hoped to fulfill for any kind of social ranking?
So I think one of the issues with the social credit system and the way that you always see it reported is that oftentimes it's reported as if it's going to be completely implemented by 2020. But that's not actually what the plan really indicates. It indicates it's more like a 5-year plan. This is where we are today, and this is where we hope to be in 5 years. And this is a multi-stage, multi-decade project. And so the biggest problem in making social credit function is that you do need government agencies to share data, and you need entities to share data. And that's something that the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to do for years. It involves dealing with issues like corruption and power and the contest for power between different officials. And so that's not something that's completely solved, and I don't know that it ever will be, because social credit it's not something that's creating a rule bylaw. It's not helping civil society. It's trying to eliminate the need for both. And so I think that the system is further advanced than, say, if you go back to the early 1990s with e-government projects, the grid management in the early 2000s. Those are all parts of what allows social credit to take place on a technical level. Things have improved since then, but it's a multi-stage process. And even the party itself says this is never going to be complete. We're always going to be working on it. But I think it's also a little bit more advanced than people sometimes think as well, in that you do have leading small groups across all provinces and cities that are responsible for social credit implementation, and those involve government agencies that all have a different role in social credit, and so they are forced to come together in the same room at least. And then also with things like administrative service centers in China, you have administration of, say, registering for a business or filing complaints all in the same building, which means that they are integrating information, at least in the systems in that district of that city. So there is a little bit more, I think, a little bit more advanced, but then you still have the issues of corruption and power, and that's never going to go away.
Thank you. Yes, sir, in the centre.
It's Tim Holborn speaking. I've got a question about personhood and digital agency. So digital identity systems and the way in which that relates to natural persons. It's a complex topic, so the easiest way to explain it is companies have buildings in the physical world and they have servers in the virtual world. So if you think about companies and governments and all of these legal personalities, they've all got their own shelters. But human beings don't really have that. We have services generally provided by America, governed under international law, whereby it says, disputes for using the service are under choice of law, California, generally. So given that we're Australian, by law, international law, we're legal aliens. So if we were going to, in Australia, build infrastructure to provide human beings shelter in cyberspace, who should own it? Should it be companies? Should it be government? Or should it be people? And what, if anything, is government doing to go about building these digital twin infrastructure for us as citizens?
Okay, thank you. Fergus, I might throw this to you, tricky though it may be.
Sure. No, I think that's a really great question. This is one of the things that I think is fundamental that we need to grapple with as citizens. There's a digital identity that's being rolled out in Australia right now. So there's active trials going on. 500,000 Australians are meant to have been using the new government's digital ID system that's based on a biometric of your face that you didn't consent to but has been built nonetheless. And so that data is being transmitted all the time, and there's we're now in the situation if we don't get protections around this law, that you can have what's called attribute exchanges. And so there's large companies that are looking at the Australian market, because it has lax regulation, to build what are called attribute exchanges. So the gentleman here might like a red wine in the evening, and he might get tagged with his digital ID for the red wine. Another person, this lady here, might be interested in very very big fan of Bunnings, always shopping at Bunnings and buying particular products. And it's previously, you might have people with the same name. It's very hard to disaggregate who's doing what, even if you've got a loyalty card with Woolworths or Bunnings or the Liquorland. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to know that you're also doing, shopping at Bunnings, you're also buying cat food. Now with digital identity, you're able to twin all that up. And so that if you're a business that wants to know about a prospective employee, if you're the Qantas Club that wants to know whether you want this person in your group, you can go to an attribute vendor and you can get pieces of information that are sold 12 different locations around the economy and build up a profile of individuals. So that's a really distressing sort of way that this kind of technology could be misused, and at the moment it's open to being misused in that way. And essentially that would have the effect in reality of helping people in high socioeconomic status get more advantages, and people in low socioeconomic conditions be trodden down further. So it's a very sort of problematic question. How you deal with that, I think, is by giving people control over their own data. And we've got a consumer data right that's been introduced. That means you can essentially borrow your data. So you can take your data from an electricity company and force that electricity company to give it to another electricity company that you want to switch over to. Doesn't mean that you personally own the data. So I think we need a sort of an even more thorough law around that puts the consumers in the driving seat. Where that actually sits, there's a lot of complexity about that, because it's probably not going to sit in your own personal piece of infrastructure. But I think those types of questions are ones that we really need to grapple with, because as we get more and more data trails, like Sam's been talking about with the social credit scheme, you get a lot more ability to manipulate people, to control them, and potentially to suppress them.
Yeah, I'm seeing several hands, but I'm going to come man over here, and then I think I've got one at the back as well. Yes? Okay, we'll come up to you in a bit.
Thank you both very much. It's just been such a fantastic conversation. My question is a bit of a kind of why should we be panicking here reflection. And this is mainly because in my teaching we've been looking at Durkheim. So 19th century, the technology was religion from him, about manipulating social norms, creating social cohesion, social control. 20th century, the dastardly black and white television was going to take our brains away. And now we have this other technology. So should actually we be panicking? That's the question.
So it's back to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, isn't it? And the don't panic across the front of it. So should we be whipping out our Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and not panicking?
I don't know that we should be panicking, but I think we should be asking a lot more questions from a wider, oftentimes if you think about the questions about particularly China and tech expansion overseas, people are very focused on espionage. And they forget the other important questions. I mentioned civil liberties earlier. And I think oftentimes if we aren't framing the issue correctly, we aren't going to ask the right questions. And that will lead to panic later on if we don't address those questions now. They're important things to be asking, particularly around individual privacy. And I think the biggest issue is that people are signing up to a lot of things. You sign up to Uber, and all of a sudden you're creating a data trail of your daily life and everywhere. Uber knows where I live and where I go to work and where I like to grocery shop. And you don't think about that. You think of it as a convenience. It is a convenience. I don't have to drive. And yet at the same time, all of that data can be used against me, and that's something that you don't quite understand because you don't have to think about it in your day-to-day life. And those are things that that we have to ask more questions about. And I think oftentimes, because I'm focused on China, and when I'm asked by, say, policymakers, will these technologies be exported to other authoritarian regimes? Do we have to worry about that? And of course, that's a concern because at ASPI, we've created a map showing where some of this technology has been exported. Mapping China's tech giants. But at the same time, we aren't asking what can that technology do, the seemingly harmless technology that's providing much needed services at a low cost and effectively globally in liberal democracies. What kind of problems can that create? Because then again, it goes back to it's not necessarily the piece of technology and how it's being used. If it's for traffic management, it's who has access to the data. It's not just the city, it's the person controlling the service as well, and that would be the company that provided that technology. And who are they giving your data to? And so there are questions to be very concerned about, but maybe panic isn't the word. Yeah.
Thank you. I got a question up the back there. Yep.
Hi, this is Dian from Griffith. Thank you for a very enlightening talk. I actually was very much just following up from the discussion, but more particularly around mobile payment. As we know, in the Gold Coast, I noticed that Alipay, for example, and WePay is now prevalent. And what I'm worried is how much Australia is looking at how it affects our taxation in the future. Because as we know, Alipay and WePay actually cannot be set up here in Australia. For example, we cannot set up such an account. So has there been any policy around the economy and how it affects the economy of the future? And is it sustainable? So I always have that question. Thank you.
So I guess which one of you wants to handle this one? And let me just kind of, because in the old days, it was the big challenge was credit cards, wasn't it? Certain credit cards were linked to certain banks in certain countries, and so certain countries didn't want to have American Express cards. Everybody had Visa, but they didn't necessarily spread. Now, are these things like Alipay and so on the same kinds of things as just a digital credit card, or is there more to it than that? And what are the regulatory regimes which we might set up around those things?
I'm happy to have a crack if you do.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is emblematic of a whole bunch of problems we have with new technology. So an example that I get a lot in Southeast Asia, for example, is they earn a lot of their money from tariffs. And that's a manufactured product that they meet at the border. They slap 10% on the price, the government gets a revenue stream. And that's a big part of their tax base. And what they're worried about with 3D printing is if you can manufacture that product in your home with a 3D printer, they're no longer getting the tariff at the border, and they're set up to tax at the border. And this is playing out in a whole bunch of different technologies, whether it's your iPhone and where it's manufactured, whether it's a piece of software that you're just downloading off the internet, but the revenue's going directly to whichever country they're selling from. It's really difficult to tax and work out an equitable way to tax these products in a way that makes sense. So it's absolutely, I think, front of mind for a whole bunch of governments around the world how to deal with this problem. Do they have any good solutions? I haven't seen any proposals that sort of strike that sweet spot of not taxing the companies 25 times for the same thing, and if every government does it, it's going to be quite a disaster in terms of driving innovation. And I think no one's got a good answer for this yet, but it's definitely front of mind.
We've probably got time for just squeeze in one more if someone's got some burning issue. Yes.
Thanks, guys. That was a really interesting discussion. Just from an individual viewpoint, what's your best advice on how we tackle this? Should I be writing my local MP? Should I be protesting to Canberra? How do we tackle it? Because it's such a massive issue, and we're just individuals. We don't have much power individually, but how do we go about it?
Samantha?
I think one of the biggest issues is just education. I think that, a lot of the problems, you can kind of sense them if you were to actually sit down and read the terms and conditions of every app that you download. Or nobody does that. I don't do that. And I think that, in the same way that there's public education campaigns about wearing your seatbelt or not smoking or not drinking and driving, there could be public education about data privacy. And I think that's not a complete solution, but that's definitely something that is, I think, a fairly, it's tried and tested. We know it works. So that's one thing with other issues. And second, it's, I think, something that's an immediate, quicker solution than some of the other bigger policy questions. Yeah.
Can I jump in on this? I mean, I used to run the Lowy poll, and one of the questions we asked was, what are your attitudes towards democracy? And what you've seen in sort of certain cohorts is a sort of steady decline in people who think that democracy is even worthwhile anymore. And what you see in global polling is a long-term downwards trend in trust in basic public institutions that underpin democracy. So I think all of that adds up to is quite a dark space in terms of responding to probably what's going to be the biggest sort of civil rights and individual freedoms question that we're going to have for a long time to deal with. So I think the number one thing is getting engaged in a way that I don't think we're used to in Australia, because we've never had to have a big, a civil war or a huge civil rights movement to get to where we are. So I think that's a really big question. That's a really big valuable contribution you could make, is just getting involved and scrutinising some of these things like the digital identity system, like the face identification service, that are going to transform Australian society, but no one's really having a debate about.
Okay, look, it's been a great pleasure for me to be involved in this evening, and I'd like to thank you, but that's not my job. So I need to hand over to Chris Staines for the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's a very complex task to try and I won't try and synthesise the nature of the conversation we've just had, but I think all of us in the room feel that it's far more complex than it first appears. And when I think about recent programs on the ABC about the social credit system, there's been the FIS project that you've also talked about as well in your discussion, Fergus. There's been a bit of coverage on that as well, but I feel like all of a sudden I'm in the boat of the questioner who asked about whether we ought to or not panic. And it really is such a complex, wicked problem with which we're dealing, and it seems to me at a simple level to be a fundamental clash of values. In the Western democratic system, we go to the polity to seek permission to do the things we do to it and with it. But in authoritarian regimes, that nicety is surplus to requirement. It's unnecessary in order for the state to preserve itself, that it makes those decisions for and on behalf of the population, for the good of the population. So there's this kind of fundamental clash of values, and it's a little bit like the Cold War is still playing out. We've just stopped it with the Berlin Wall, but we've continued it in cyberspace. And many of these value systems that are in conflict, I guess in the 21st century, we might still play them out in the Straits of Hormuz or in the South China Sea. There are still there's still gunboat stuff going on. But when you talked earlier on about 20 different attacks on elections occurring in democratic societies that were either perpetrated by China or by Russia, that's got to give us more pause than just how was Trump elected. There's a lot at stake here for all of us, and the fact that our own government apparently was cyber attacked, was it in July, by China, and that Parliament House's system was hacked into. I mean, I'm just picking up snatches and snippets of news that all of us are exposed to every day, and both of you clearly are deeply immersed in it. And I began to worry, just as an ordinary citizen, whether we were doing enough in a way to fend off these threats. Because if the threats were being made militarily, we'd somehow all be inspired to rise up in our defence. But the threats on this occasion are almost being made invisibly. And as a consequence, it's very hard to know where to point your firepower toward which enemy. And it's really a devilishly difficult issue. And I think you've done a lot tonight for those of us who are not experts in the audience. I'm sure there are many experts, but for those who are not, you've given us, I think, a really rich sense of both the nature and the ubiquity of the problem. If we thought it was local and targeted, it's invisibly in the world everywhere. And that's a really hard thing with which to wrestle, I think, for ordinary citizens, as one of the last questioners said, like, how do we deal with this? We hope that our governments are dealing smartly and well on our behalf, and there's a lot of seen and unseen things that they're doing. But I think all of us as Australians are very quick to sort of push back when we feel our own privacy is being somehow impinged as a result of the efforts of government in order to contain some of these issues for us. I think the Qantas Taiwan one was a really, really interesting example. It was a bit of a tipping point in some way for Australia. So are we going to allow our national carrier to kind of comply, or are we just going to let them make a decision as a business? Do we have a government position on that? I'm sure we do, but in a sense it became a business decision. And some people thought it was a sellout, and others thought it was what you need to do in order to survive in the market within which we're working. So God knows you've given us a lot to think about tonight. It's really terrific to have the experience and expertise that both of you bring to the subject matter, I think, to kind of unpack it for us in a way that at least I think we walk out of this room far better informed for many of us than I think we were when we walked in. So for that, can I invite you please again to very generously thank our guests.